Good morning and welcome to today's online presentation from Hawkridge Systems. My name is Glenn White. I'm the Simulation Product Manager here at Hawkridge. And today we're going to be talking about applications of SOLIDWORKS Simulation and other analysis tools from us here at Hawkridge Systems. With regard to life sciences and medical devices and those sort of industries. So, what are we going to look at today? Well, one of the common questions we get from people as we, talk about analysis with our customers and prospects is, which type of analysis do I have? When we as software providers present functionality, we often throw up, these complex matrix slides with all the different modules and functionality that are available in software. But the challenge for the user or the prospective buyer of the software is connecting this with, my real-life application that I have day to day. And so what we've tried to put together here this month at Hawkridge Systems is a simulation buyer's guide. It's a semi-technical document that kind of goes through for the different types of tasks you need to consider. What are the options? What piece of software do they come in? And what are some of the decision points that you need to consider as you go through? And once you've made those decisions, what are the pros and cons of that interface? And there'll be a copy of this buyer's guide delivered to you at the conclusion of the session in a follow-up email. So we presented that a couple of weeks ago. We launched that a couple of weeks ago. And we've done a couple of follow-up sessions applying those concepts to particular industry segments. So today's session is based around applying the concepts available that we discuss in that buyer's guide, applying it to medical and life science applications and addressing some of those decision points. So just to give you a basic overview of the landscape here of what we provide at Hawkridge Systems in terms of analysis and simulation tools. Most of the time, our offering starts with talking about structural stress analysis. We have a comprehensive static stress analysis tool as part of SOLIDWORKS Premium. And then we can extend the functionality of that with upgrade packages to SOLIDWORKS Simulation Professional to address frequency and modal analysis, to look at fatigue, add an optimization routine, etc. And then up to Simulation Premium for nonlinear and dynamic situations. We have a CFD tool, SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation, very comprehensive thermal and CFD tool. Sustainability package for life cycle assessments of the environmental impact of your design decisions. We have an plastics injection molding tool, available in professional premium and advanced packages to tell you if you're going to be able to mold a plastic object. And then for analysis tasks that have high levels of complexity and kind of go beyond what we can do in our simulation premium package, we went out and sourced SIMULIA Abaqus as a high-end analyst level software for the really tough problems. So looking at all these things that the softwares do can get a little confusing. So we kind of broke it down in the simulation buyer's guide, we break it down into 6 areas. Static structural loading, dynamic structural loading, thermal analysis, flow, fluid flow analysis, optimization, automation tools, and plastic injection molding analysis. And today, talking about medical devices and those sort of things, we're going to break out 3 of those and talk about them in more detail. Static structural analysis, blending into nonlinear situations, flow analysis, blending into multi-physics, and we'll talk about thermal modeling at the end. Okay. That looks a little better. So now let's go take a look at these three areas: static structural, flow and multi-physics, and thermal modeling. So let's start off with static structural analysis. At its core, it is the response to things that we model to mechanical loads, forces, pressures, torques, physical movement of parts, static movement, so small deformation movement. We can blend this up into estimations of fatigue based on those static loads, and also look at buckling behavior. We can include linear and non-linear approximations of situations. And linear approximations use linear material models. They assume small deformations, and they assume static loading. Now we have a range of tools available that can handle this stuff, static structural analysis. Every license of SOLIDWORKS has a Simulation Express, that's single part level, limited condition, stress analysis. When you move up into full simulation, you have assembly level stress analysis, a fairly comprehensive set of tools there, but it considers linear material behavior. Simulation Professional adds buckling and fatigue behavior, as well as some optimization and productivity tools. And then our Simulation Premium package adds a nonlinear capability, nonlinear material models and large displacements and large distortions, really common in medical devices, all the way up at the top. But for things that are very large deformations, very complex materials, SIMULIA Abaqus is the real tool that will enable that. So if we take a look at some of the things that we hear as we're out there in the industry, looking at talking to people, what we see in the medical devices a lot is that our products undergo really large distortions, right? They're pushing against biological materials. They're made of nitinol. Take a classic example is like an arterial stent, which is at a certain diameter but is compressed to a very, very small diameter for the insertion process. And the other thing is predictions of fatigue life become important. Right? If you're putting an object, especially implantable stuff, you've got to be absolutely sure you're not going to see a failure during the expected lifetime of that product, because the consequences can be devastating, both financially in terms of returns and litigation, and also for the patient involved. So we kind of start with static stress analysis and SOLIDWORKS Premium for a lot of these different things. We look at nonlinear analysis in SOLIDWORKS Simulation Premium, and that can handle kind of mid-range deformations, pretty complex material models, but doesn't necessarily have all of them. And then for a lot of things with the very high distortions, we're looking at SIMULIA Abaqus as a kind of next level solution there. So let's take a peek at a couple of static examples. Okay, so the first one we'll look at here is this one is it's a Mediject insulin pen. Okay, the diabetics can inject themselves with insulin, a nice, easy to access object, or easy to use tool. All right, we've basically got this mechanical part. All right, a force on the top goes through the injection process to run, reloads the insulin dose. And so you've just got all these kind of plastic parts that interact mechanically. And linear static stress analysis allows us to go in and apply loading to each one and evaluate the stress levels. For example, we could apply a thumb or an actuating force to the top here and see how that develops stress in all the walls as it goes down. Now, the one I've chosen to look at here is we have a kind of a clip fit between these two parts, so that when you compress the object, when you actuate it, it has a satisfying click into place, and then there's a twist action to reload the next dose, which causes it to pop out. And so I've looked at two of the parts here in isolation as part of a secondary analysis. See if we can get those parts on the screen here. There we go. Okay, so I'm just considering the two parts, kind of one on top of the other, and I'm really wanting to understand how this part moves past the clip and how that clip engages, and whether I have sufficient strength in the root of this little clip fit item in order to perform the action I need. Now, I'm not expecting any of these parts to yield during this action. Right? If I was to run this action 20, 30, 40 times, and I saw yielding after each one, I'm very quickly going to distort these parts into a shape or a stress level that's non-sustainable. Right? So the stresses I'm expecting here are going to be below the yield strength. So that often leads us towards a static analysis or a linear analysis. But what we do have here is we have moving contact. We have this part basically transiting past the clip here, and that's going to cause a moving contact position, which we don't do well in a linear analysis. So in fact, this is going to be a nonlinear analysis. The setup of the nonlinear analysis is pretty straightforward. I've defined the material properties of the parts that I'm working with, and I'm using linear material assumptions here. So just the stiffness and Poisson's ratio are the main inputs that we'd utilize. We've got most of the parts excluded, so that's a nice function in SOLIDWORKS Simulation. You can have the whole assembly in place, but only consider 2 or 3 of the parts. And we can, I've added contact conditions between these two parts. I've got I've identified faces on the blue part and faces on the cream colored part that are going to come into contact, and I've defined a condition called node penetration. Okay, what node penetration means is it enables me to have these parts slide on top of each other. The parts are able to separate. The floating causes that to happen. And yeah, but they can't go through each other. In terms of how the parts move, I've got the cream part fixed at its root. That's where it connects to the next part in the system. And I've asked the blue part to basically move from left to right a distance of 4 millimeters. Right? That should be enough for it to move past the guide there. So that's pretty simple setup, and we can go off and solve the analysis. It's a nonlinear analysis. So when you do a nonlinear analysis, it solves a series of iterative steps to progress through the loading profile. And we can actually dial up each one of these steps as an individual kind of view. So we can see, stress levels as it just starts to engage on the clip there. We can look at stress levels as it maybe reaches the point of maximum deflection. And past, but we can also go away and animate these, and that's often a more interesting way to view it. Or we can look at numerical data versus analysis progress, really rich inputs that we can evaluate here. But in this particular case, it gives us really good insight into the deformation behavior of how this object moves through. Okay. There we go. So let's, you know, it's an example. It is a nonlinear example, but it uses linear material models. If we didn't have as much movement, we could apply loads and forces to this and solve this problem with either SOLIDWORKS Premium or SOLIDWORKS Simulation Professional. And what I've done here uses SOLIDWORKS Simulation Premium. So if we move on to the next thing, the classic kind of case that people think of when they talk about nonlinear analysis in the medical device industry is some sort of stent, right? A device that's implanted inside either an artery or some other vessel of a patient, and it's basically doing the job of holding that vessel open so it doesn't collapse, as the collapse is causing medical conditions. It's a pretty complex situation. The way the parts are made from typically some variation of nitinol, which is a shape memory alloy. And they're typically compressed to a very small diameter, put into a syringe or some other injection or delivery mechanism, injected into the patient, at which point they kind of recall their original shape and expand back out to that original shape. And we can approach this in SOLIDWORKS Simulation Premium, but sometimes the degree of deformation and the complexity of the analysis is kind of a step too far. And so I wanted to try and illustrate that, but I should point out before I do so that, you know, what I'm illustrating here is kind of a sample to give you an idea of the ballpark of the analysis that each software can achieve. It's by no means an absolute limit, and I could do stuff to what I'm about to show you that would allow it to go further and get further, but it should give you an idea of kind of what's possible. So I'm looking here at a portion of a stent. Okay, to make things simpler, I cut it into a quarter of the true model. Actually cut it, just a quarter of the true model. So I'm only looking at a portion of it, and I've applied symmetry boundary conditions to the cut faces. Now I want to see how this part might distort if I expand it, and also if I compress it. It's going to happen in both phases of the behavior. So in terms of the material definition here, I've utilized a nitinol material model that's part of SOLIDWORKS Simulation Premium. And if you look at a stress-strain curve for material called nitinol, it looks absolutely nothing like you'd expect for a classic stress-strain curve for a plastic or for a steel or aluminum or that sort of thing. There's a reference in the SOLIDWORKS help file here, which is basically showing some typical loading and unloading curves for a particular grade of nitinol. So highly nonlinear behavior, and the way we define these curves is by identifying these breakpoints and the slopes of the lines as they kind of move through this pattern. So all the data that you see expressed here is information about the loading and unloading behavior of this nitinol material. And so I start off with some sort of reference pressure on the inside, and if I run an analysis on that to see how it expands, we can actually get quite a long way. Right? You're looking at kind of the effective shape change under a small pressure load, and even though I've modeled a quarter of it, I can replicate the result over into to show the full round, we can see we can achieve some pretty extreme deformation. Right? It's pretty impressive how much of a shape change that SOLIDWORKS simulation can account for here, and we can look at stress levels that are developed through here. And in this case, we would have significantly exceeded any sort of failure stresses of this material, and so we'd predict some sort of failure long before it got to this size. But we're talking hundreds of % of strain that's available when we distort this outwards. See how the shape of it is changing as it's being asked to go out there. So pretty extreme displacement. Or if we try to compress the shape, we try and pull it inwards, we very quickly get to a point where the arms start to kind of rub together, and we resolve that with contact interactions between all the faces that may meet. And once we start getting into contact modeling, things get a little tougher for us in SOLIDWORKS Simulation Premium. If we were to compress the thing, we get to the point where the parts come together. We can resolve a little bit further, but ultimately the degree of deformation we can see going inwards is a lot smaller. This is in the ballpark of the limit of what we've been able to achieve. Now, this is the part in isolation. If we were to put, a model of an arterial vessel, artery wall, or even an internal balloon that's sometimes used for inflation, the contact modeling is going to mean it's going to make it difficult to get very far in terms of the distortion. So anytime you want to consider those sort of conditions, multiple contact interactions, large distortion, all that stuff combined, it's often a more appropriate choice to go look at a tool like SIMULIA Abaqus. In this little graphical example here, we have two sets of contact interaction. We've got an internal balloon, we've got an external arterial vessel wall that we're deforming that's made of kind of biomaterial. So we've got a unique material model for that. We've got a 9-0 material model for the stent. And so Abaqus is better equipped to handle the large distortion and the contact conditions all at once. So it's kind of a ballpark idea of, the differences between the tools. They are both doing fundamentally the same thing, but there is a difference in how far you can push the distortion and the deformation of the nonlinear solver in Simulation Premium. And then we can get into some very, we're still talking about SIMULIA Abaqus here. There is an example from Bausch & Lomb. They make intraocular lenses, so basically implantable lenses for cataract surgery. They go into a patient's eye, and what they need to do is to basically fold this lens into a syringe and almost inject it into a patient's eye, and then have it kind of fold out to the required shape. And so you can see some very, very complex, very large distortion material behavior at the bottom here. Let's see if I can make that play again. And, contact between the object, the syringe wall, and, so we've got the ability here to really look at extreme distortions and extreme deformation when you take that next step to a tool like SIMULIA Abaqus. So we've almost got the spectrum of kind of the simplicity of doing the analysis. Starts pretty simple with SOLIDWORKS Premium. It's a little bit more involved with Simulation Premium. It's a little more complex with SIMULIA Abaqus, but the complexity of what you get out of it also increases as well. So if we change tack a little bit here and move away from kind of structural loads and distortions and how parts are going to move when loads are applied, let's talk about fluid flow. Okay, so fluid flow is basically the assessment of how gases or liquids are going to flow around or through the object you are designing. Applications that make sense in the medical device industry are things like mixing patterns for different fluids, visualization of how blood or drugs or other medical fluids might move through systems, past valves, through reducers, that sort of thing. And often we can include this with thermal analysis. Okay, so making assessments of heating and cooling at the same time as we're seeing how things flow. And our CFD tool, Flow Simulation, does all that kind of implicitly. We have 3 fluid flow analysis tools. The first one's in every license of SOLIDWORKS. It's called Flow Express. It does very simple internal flow, 1 inlet, 1 outlet, air or water only. And all you get as an output is kind of a visual indication of the flow streams. SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation is our comprehensive CFD tool. It's we think it's the easiest to use CFD solution on the market today. It gives really good accuracy for the situations it's able to handle. Includes a variety of functions: incompressible, compressible flows, non-Newtonian, Newtonian fluids. A classic example of a non-Newtonian fluid is blood. We'll do mixing, we'll do rotating geometry, do heat transfer. Very capable CFD solution. And then the next step there is SIMULIA Abaqus. In this sort of environment, the main things that can get you into is considering kind of multi-physics or fluid structure interaction, where a flow is pushing on a solid which is deforming and changing the flow as it deforms. So first, the example I wanted to look at here, if we start off in SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation, is a medical device application for a piece of respiratory equipment. It is a tool called the oxy-arm. The idea of an oxy-arm is that for a patient that requires oxygen therapy, the typical mode of application for this is to put a tube up their nose and connect it to an oxygen source and kind of carry it around all day. The idea of an oxy-arm is that it's less invasive, and by providing oxygen to a arm that's worn as a headset, it'll blow it to their nose and mouth. They'll get an appropriate oxygen mix at that location, and it's less invasive than having a nasal cannula or something like that. So what we need to know as an analyst here is what sort of oxygen concentration is the patient seeing, and how can we adjust the design of the oxy-arm kind of little vessel here? How can we adjust that design to optimize what the patient sees? We've got a kind of a baffle here and a diffuser to disperse and spread the flow accordingly. We could also investigate how different positions of this little arm, the arm is obviously adjustable. We could explore how they affect the therapy the patient receives. And the setup for something like this is pretty straightforward in SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation. Flow Simulation automatically knows where all the solid pieces of the model are. So we just need to tell it where to define the fluid region. And we've identified a fluid region just by specifying some XYZ coordinates or push and pulling a box on the screen that encompasses the arm and the whole head. we're going to tell the software that we're considering a mixture of air and oxygen. And by default, everything in this box is considered to be 100% air right now. Okay. We have a flow source at the delivery point to the little oxy arm here, where we're providing 10 liters a minute of flow, and we are providing that as 100% oxygen, pure oxygen. Now, you don't want to deliver 100% oxygen to the patient necessarily for long-term care. So we're hoping we get some mixing and some diffusion as it kind of comes out of here before it reaches the patient. And so we go off and run that analysis. That's essentially the setup. We've got a computational domain that's filled with air, and we're inserting oxygen. And we go off and run that, and it's going to analyze both the fluid patterns and the concentration of flow, the concentration of the fluid as it gets through. And there's a variety of ways we can interrogate that. One of the simplest is to take a slice through the model at a particular plane and look at certain properties. We could look at the oxygen concentration. We can use the probe tool to pull off, a numeric value of what that concentration is at the nose and mouth. It looks like it's around 50% right now. An idea of what these contours look like, and also view other parameters. So I could go have a look at, the velocity patterns, where we've got high velocity, where we've got low velocity. You can control the bounds on this to see some different things. Almost got this velocity current that's in this particular position. It's going above the bridge of the nose, so maybe we could bring this down and angle it up more. And we've got really rich control here. We can let's bring these results in. We can overlay things like the oxygen concentration seen by different portions of this patient's face. Because the flow is coming in from the side and it has a very sharp turn, it's non-symmetric, right? And that could potentially be an issue. Actually, that's velocity. We can go look at oxygen concentration as well. Still non-symmetric. We are striking the nose and mouth pretty well. The variety of things we can interrogate here. But we also have some design parameters available to us, particularly around the design of this little mushroom valve through here. Okay, we can adjust the angle of these arms, we can adjust the spacing, and because we're inside of SOLIDWORKS, there's nothing stopping us from finding the geometry we want to look at, double-clicking, identifying the dimensions, and changing them. As soon as we change something, it's ready to be analyzed. Because we're completely in sync with our CAD model. We would just change this value and hit solve. Now, we can also automate that process a little bit. Flow simulation has parametric analysis capability. And so it enables us to go to something called a parametric study and identify some parameters we might want to change. So I could identify the angle of this as a parameter of interest, the offset as a parameter of interest, and I could run a batch of analyses based on different variations of these factors. And in fact, the makers of Oxyarm did this. If we switch back PowerPoint, first they looked at one parameter. They looked at basically the offset of the little valve. How do things change as we push it from a very small throw, go a little larger, larger again. But this was a single setup. We had to hit run one time, and it went off and ran these 5 variations. And as you can see, there's some significant differences in the received oxygen for these 5 different cases. So that would be what we call a single factor design study. You can also go to a 2-factor design study, where we're changing both the offset on the horizontal axis and the angle on the vertical. In this case, it's 25 analyses run with a single click. So there's a little bit of solve time involved there, but again, we can go interrogate these outputs and grab the one that looks like most optimized for our situation. And this really is activated by this connection we have between CAD and CFD. Everything we've done here is a steady state analysis. We basically turn on the flow, see how the flow patterns develop, and look at kind of how it would stack up if it was like that for a period of time. The next thing we might want to do is we could look at a transient situation. This is sort of a breathing simulation they put together, where at different times in this video, there's fluid inhaled through the mouth, and then exhaled through the nose. And how does that affect the flow patterns and the oxygen concentration as we move through that cycle? So we're looking at more than just a steady state analysis. We're getting into, we call it transient flow. And that's certainly possible in SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation as well. So there are a couple of limitations to SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation. One, we cannot analyze moving geometry or deforming geometry at the same time as we analyze the flow situation. We're also unable to represent free surfaces of fluid. So for those next step analysis conditions that do exceed what's possible in SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation, again, we look at SIMULIA Abaqus. We've got a few little situations here. Got some kind of flutter or deformable valves in a flow stream. And as we manipulate this flow, these objects are deforming, actually opening up. That's a one-way valve there. And so that's what we call fluid structure interaction, FSI. Pretty interesting stuff to look at. And we've got little stress contours that are being evaluated on these 2 valves in sync with what the flow is doing. We've got a drop test in this case, a very dynamic event of a bag filled with fluid. It might be a saline bag or something like that. So we've got a free surface of fluid. We're actually using a technique called CEL here, coupled Euler-Lagrangian, an approach to CFD that we can utilize. We've got a peristaltic pump. Basically, it's being used to drive flow through this tube by deforming the walls of the tube periodically. Pretty interesting situation. And then some kind of flutter valves again that are being deformed by flow. We can also get up into the modeling of some pretty complex biological passages. We've got some stuff that's been modeled here. See how they deform as flow goes through them, and that sort of stuff. So Abaqus really offers a next level solution to those situations. Okay, so the last area I wanted to kind of cover here, I'm running a little short on time, is thermal analysis. If you were here last week when we talked about high tech in electronic situations, we talked a lot about thermal analysis and how when we talk about thermal analysis, we're looking at how heat flows through models, and we're considering really three mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. We have two approaches to thermal analysis available in our SOLIDWORKS environment: SOLIDWORKS Simulation Professionals, an FEA-based approach. And when we do that, we don't model any airflow, or fluid flow. So when we make an assessment of convection, we have to have a guess at it, basically. We have to provide a convection coefficient that mimics the rate of convection heat transfer and apply that to faces in the model. SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation, again, is a CFD-based approach to thermal analysis. It's going to include all the fluid flow stuff we just looked at, as well as the heat transfer processes. And when we do convection in that tool, we calculate the convective rate precisely from how the fluid moves and what sort of fluid it is, and that sort of stuff. And what that means as a net result is that the CFD approach is a lot more accurate because it makes less assumptions than an FEA approach. FEA approach runs a little faster, it's in a lower cost software package, but doesn't have the accuracy. And so when we go out and look at industry trends, there's many medical devices that also include some sort of electronics. And while there are lots of applications that we run into to do with the heating and cooling of fluids as they're being, moved into a patient or around a patient, or to cool an injury or that sort of thing, a lot of the CFD and thermal applications and medical devices are around supporting electronics. And so what we continually hear is that more and more electrical power is being put into smaller boxes. And because of that, just a best guess at a thermal solution is not enough anymore. And thermal cooling solutions really need to be optimized for each situation they're going in. Optimize heat sink choice, heat sink position, any fans that are used. So it really leads to CFD for a lot of this stuff. So a CFD tool like SOLIDWORKS Flow Simulation, heating and cooling is the most common application of that tool. It allows us to basically model fans, heat sources, electronic components, hit go, and see what the flow patterns develop like, and see what temperatures we're achieving inside that box. From there, because we're tied to the SOLIDWORKS CAD solution, we can then go about optimizing the individual conditions: fan positions, heat sink positions, heat source locations, flow directing devices like baffles or deflectors. Go optimize all that stuff to get an ideal thermal solution to a particular problem. And if we are working with electronics, we also have an extension module to give us more accuracy in certain key areas of the software. So that brings me to the end of what I plan to cover today. You'll see more detail in a lot of these kind of analysis tools and situations in our simulation buyer's guide. Like I said, that'll be mailed to you as a follow-up to today's session. Coming up, we're doing another one of these sessions to close out our simulation month that we do every year in May. That's looking at applications of these sort of tools to industrial equipment and oil and gas and more of the heavy industry side of things. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up at our webinar page. But at this point, I'd really like to open the floor up for any questions that people may have on the applications that we've discussed today. And also thank you for attending. We appreciate your attention. We appreciate you joining us. We hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, comments, or things that you want to follow up on, my contact information is on the screen, along with our general phone numbers that you can contact anyone at Hawkridge Systems. So with that, we'll pause. I'll hang out here for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free to log them through the question interface and go to webinar. And thanks again for attending.